Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to History, Housing, and Heat, the impact of climate change on low-income communities of color. I am Grace Willis. I'm a rising senior at Missouri State University studying English literature, and I am working this summer with the YWCA in Birmingham, Alabama. And I've had the privilege of doing data analysis for them and working on some grant writing. They work to empower women and eliminate racism. If you're new to SHEP, I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to our event, which is the final of 4 keynote events hosted across the spring and summer. By way of context, SHEP is an interinstitutional collaboration among 24 colleges and universities across the country, aimed at supporting undergraduate education about poverty through curriculum, community-based experiences, and a shared summer internship. It is week 7 of that internship, which includes 157 interns from 23 colleges and universities who are working with over 100 agencies and cities across the country in a variety of fields. Every summer, our academic program frames this experience by focusing on a theme that intersects with our 3 student learning outcomes: knowledge, engagement, and responsibility. 2021 has us doing work to examine the ways in which race and poverty intersect, challenging us to explore the complexity of individual experiences that develop out of the systemic injustices that obstruct access, personal security, and thriving. By doing so, SHEP is highlighting the work of innovators in the field who have a lot to teach us about solutions-focused approaches within the field of social justice. Tonight's event will be recorded and available for later viewing on SHEP's YouTube channel. Please feel free to utilize the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our panelists at any time during the event. And so without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. I will say I'm personally very excited for this discussion and to hear what they have to say. I did a little bit of reading on my own prior to the event, and I think this will be a very insightful time for all of us. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Jeremy Hoffman. He is the David and Jane Kahn Scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia and affiliate faculty in the L. Douglas Wilder School and the Center for Environmental Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Hoffman connects audiences to their changing planet through participatory environmental research and interactive, hands-on, and immersive experiences. I apologize, the lights just went out in the study room I'm in. Dr. Hoffman, in doing this, earns recognition through his research being featured in the New York Times, National Geographic, the Washington Post, as well as being selected as one of Style Weekly Richmond's top 40 under 40 in 2019, and one of the Grist 50 Fixers for 2020. I would also like to introduce you to Dr. Vivek Shandas. He is a professor of climate adaptation and director of the Sustaining Urban Places Research Lab at Portland State University. Professor Shandas supports public, private, and nonprofit organizations in identifying and evaluating adaptations to climate-induced stressors, including extreme events such as urban heat, air quality, and storms. He has published over 100 articles, 3 books, and his research has been featured in the New York Times, National Geographic, Scientific American, and dozens of other national and local media. Dr. Shandas serves as chair of the City of Portland's Urban Forestry Commission and serves on several local and national advisory boards. During his spare time, he revels in the mountains and waters of the Pacific Northwest and pines for late night tacos anywhere he could find them. So without further ado, I give you our panelists for tonight.
All right, good evening. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Grace. It's been a real joy working with SHEP and preparing this keynote, and we're so thrilled to be a part of this programming. I introduced myself really fast, and I'll let Vivek introduce himself. But coming to you live from Richmond, Virginia, where we've just had historically warm temperatures, very humid weather, and a code orange day air quality event brought on by the subsiding wildfire smoke transported all the way here from thousands of miles away in Canada and the Western United States. And so it's been an interesting summer so far, as I'm sure you know, and I'll let Vivek say hello to you from his neck of the woods, where another historic event has just taken place. Vivek.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Grace and Stephanie. I am really delighted to be here because in part it's now nice 80 degrees here in Portland, Oregon, where I've lived for the last 21 years. And I'll tell you, we've never had an air conditioning unit. And this massive heat dome, as it was called, where temperatures got up to 124 degrees, we were able to measure. It really broke us, and we ended up getting a little AC unit for our bedroom where the two dogs, my little 11-year-old and spouse, all kind of huddled together for those 3 days where temperatures were oppressively hot here. And so we're not used to that, and yet I think this is going to be something of a new normal that we're really going to have to try to endure and work our way through. So I'll leave it at that for now and turn it over to Jeremy.
Great. Well, it's incredible that you witnessed such historic temperatures and we're outperforming science in it at the same time. That's really, really important information. And so, yeah, well, what we're talking about tonight probably isn't a surprise to many of you in some ways, because we're learning more and more about this. And Vivek and I have been very fortunate to be near the front of some of this work over the last few years. And so we're going to share with you is just kind of some of the broad reasons why we should care about heat, especially in the face of climate change, which, climate change is not just heat. We'll kind of bring in some of the other aspects of the threats of climate change where we can. But we're really going to be focusing on most of our work, which has been in the heat space, and kind of weaving in and out through some of what Vivek and I do that I think is a little bit unique, especially Vivek's recent heat mapping campaigns across the country. You'll learn about, including here in Richmond and across Virginia, where I'm at, how transformative they've been in the process. And one thing that we always have to start with is that heat has a very real human effect. It has a very real human toll when the temperature goes up. Some of you may already know this, but heat is still the leading cause of weather-related fatalities in the United States. That was surprising to me because, we tend to hear about the more, I guess, charismatic weather events, things like hurricanes, tornadoes, and massive floods. We hear about those all the time on the news. But until the last few years, you didn't really hear about how heat waves were impacting individuals and communities. I mean, with the exception of maybe the really historic ones, such as the 2003 event in France and Europe, which killed thousands of individuals. And I want to share a little bit about myself, is that I grew up in one of the other cities that had a really famous heat wave in the city of Chicago, Illinois. And in 1995, I highly suggest, if you're interested in reading one of the kind of earliest works about the interactions between environment and social issues, Eric Kleinenberg's book, Heat Wave, A Social Autopsy of a heat wave in Chicago, is fascinating and really changes the way that I look at my upbringing. Because when we talk about poverty and we talk about racism, this picture is from this event, which the temperatures went above 110 for, I think, the heat index was over 110 for over 40 hours over a few separate days. And the temperature never went below 80 degrees for several nights. It was devastating to things like rolling blackouts, infrastructural issues like buckling roads. There were so many needs for water that pressure from releasing fire hydrants to cool people off was reducing the water pressure across the city. So unpredictable conditions in what you might expect in your day-to-day life to just work around you. But central to this disaster was the fact that elderly communities and individuals from communities of color throughout the city of Chicago were disproportionately arriving at the morgue. People were dying from extreme heat. And what the heat wave book really does is to explain some of that kind of historical disinvestment that occurred in these particular neighborhoods to produce these sorts of outcomes. And I reflect on this because only a few miles away from this picture, my family that same weekend was having a yard party for my sister's birthday. And I was enjoying myself. We had air conditioning. We had, I remember eating push pops. If anybody remembers push pops, and ice cream, and we were playing around on the slip and slide. And now, given the work that I've worked on with Vivek and through the last few years, it's really becoming clear about just how substantial the systems are at work to protect privilege and power and whiteness in cities versus at the expense of the lives of people, residents of communities of color. And I think that the Chicago heat wave does that in such a profound way to show us that reality. And so we know also, though, that heat doesn't express itself the same way everywhere. And so I want everyone that's watching, all 80-some participants, to look at this photo and imagine, if you will, let's see here, we've got the chat open, yes. If you will, if you were to fly into this picture, like we were all on the magic school bus, if you were to go into this photo and we gave you a scavenger hunt to find the warmest place to the touch, where do you think you're gonna go? On 3, I want you to maybe write in the chat or somehow express where you're gonna go, okay? Or just say it into your camera even though we can't see you. All right, 1, 2, 3. There we go, we see a couple chat. We got one brave chat. Here we go, there's a couple. Wonderful, keep them coming, keep them coming. We're making you don't have 2 scientists on a panel and not expect to do a little bit of science, making hypotheses. I like this. Now, at the same time, where do you think on 3, why don't you go ahead and give us a description of where you're gonna go to find the coolest place to the touch, okay? On 3, coolest place to the touch. 1, 2, 3. I always see, I think, Vivek, the times I've done this, I think I see more consensus in the coolest place than I see in the question about the warmest place, which is interesting. So what we can do with various forms of technology, including satellites in space, as well as cameras on the ground, is that we can take and look at how the temperatures across these different land use types vary using a thermal camera. And I took this exact same picture from the roof of the Science Museum of Virginia, looking west along Broad Street into a parking deck or a parking lot. And the FLIR camera, an infrared camera, reveals the substantial amount of variation there is of the surface temperatures around us. And so the brighter colors here are the warmer surfaces, the black asphalt being the warmest. Anything that's really dark and dense, that absorbs more of the sun's energy relatively and then re-emits it back into the air as heat throughout the afternoon and into the evening. While on the flip side of that, the darker colors here are the cooler temperatures. So of course, like many of you said, these trees, by far that shade, and the darker and deeper and denser that shade is. So even the difference between these small individual shrub-like trees versus the big mature oak tree have very substantial cooling effects on the surface, as well as the air above it. And then there's some really interesting things going on with the colors of the cars in the background here. You know, the color of those surfaces, even though they're all the same metal, basically, it's just the color can determine how much of the sun's energy is being reflected back instead of absorbed. So even just from this one photo, we can learn so much about the world around us and how different types of land use practices and the way that we build a space in a city or in a rural area even can either amplify or turn up the thermostat or turn it down and cool it off. And so the scientific community has been researching urban heat islands really substantially and significantly for the last 4 or 5 decades, but the knowledge of it goes back over a century. And one of the most kind of recent and now increasingly well established methodologies for establishing how these different land uses affect temperature in our cities was put forward and really revolutionized the kind of approach from Vivek Shandas. So I'm really pleased to hand it over to him, and he can tell you a little bit about the campaigns that they're doing. We'll kind of come back to some of it at the end, but for the most part, Vivek, why don't you bring us up to speed on a little bit of your methodology?
Sure. So one of the things that keeps coming up, and it's great to be here also, thanks, Jeremy. One of the things that keeps coming up in questions about climate and the bigger challenges related to the potential impacts of our changing climate system on kind of individual communities is what we can do about it. And one of the things that has been really compelling for us is let's get people involved in this. Let's get science as part of our process for understanding how the way we're designing our cities, our streets, our buildings, even our playgrounds, like how can we get science to help inform some of these features on the landscape, some of these places that you and I like to go, or in some cases like to avoid. And so what we've done and what we've been trying to really engage communities around is going out and collecting temperature and humidity measurements in specific places, like in Richmond or like in Birmingham, etc. And so what we're trying to do is give people a very simple tool. So that is a thermometer. Many of us have been checking our temperature since we were kids. And so why not go and use that thermometer, in this case, a scientific grade, very sensitive, calibrated thermometer, and have families go out and put it on their car, have researchers, scientists go out, have policymakers, have high school students in some cases ride their bikes with these monitors on there and go out and collect hundreds of thousands of measurements of temperature. Usually when you look at your phone and you see one temperature for a place, that usually tells you, oh, this place is, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And it might, even with humidity, feel like 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Though what we're doing with this work is trying to say, actually, there is a difference across a single city of sometimes upwards of 15 and maybe even 20 degrees Fahrenheit difference in cities based on these hundreds of thousands of individual temperature and humidity measurements that we take. And so we've been trying to engage communities in their place, trying to really activate questions, scientific as well as kind of planning and social science questions that link the process and the outcome of our built environments, of how we make decisions about our built environment, to the scientific data that allow us to then say, hey, these areas are actually much hotter than those. Why is that? What have we done to that place to amplify temperatures so much? And I'm just amazed by the fact that we've now done this almost in 50 cities around the country. And one of the things that comes up consistently is, wow, I would have never known that the temperature is really that different at the same time in the same city. In one neighborhood, someone has to run their air conditioning unit like really hard, much harder than another place in another part of town that may not have to even use an air conditioning unit in the same place. And so this particular series of what we call heat watch campaigns have really activated communities in trying to take control over their own neighborhoods, their own streets, and finding ways to cool things down, which I'll come back to later on. You go to the next slide, Jeremy. And so we did this in Richmond, and one of the examples when we go out and collect these temperatures, we see that the red areas are above 96 degrees in this case, and the blue areas are below 94 degrees. And that variation is actually, in this case, just a couple of degrees, but when you look at it as a whole, it's actually ranges much more like 13 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit difference. And again, if you're outside and it's, the airport or the one measurement tells you that it's a 90-degree day, one neighborhood might be 85 degrees and another neighborhood might be as high as 100 degrees. And so that difference in many cases could also be the difference between life and death for communities. Can you go to the next slide? Or go ahead, Jeremy.
I was just going to say that we also had such what you were speaking to about all the different groups that we brought to the table, all the volunteers. We had the city government involved. We had community nonprofits, racial equity organizations. We had the universities, and so this was really the outcome of a lot of community engagement around this topic. I just wanted to add that in, as you mentioned that was a huge part of what you've seen go on in other cities.
And you want to talk about this particular one in your hometown?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. So what we've been able to do too is using these data is to now look at very fine scale aspects of our neighborhoods around us. From energy use, as Vivek mentioned, but as most importantly is to kind of return to the example from Chicago, is to examine what is the burden of the health impact of these heat events in the city of Richmond? Who is, and what are they doing, but right around when an ambulance goes to respond to a heat-related illness? So what you're looking at on the right is a heat map of where ambulance responses for heat-related illnesses have occurred in the city of Richmond over the last 5 years. And so when we disaggregate this information, so not only is it striking how corresponding it is to the areas that are warmer, and in fact, the statistics would say that it's more likely that you're in a heat island when you experience a heat-related illness than not. Then when we look at who it is that's going in the ambulance to get heat-related illness treatment, so 60% of the cases are for Black individuals, whereas only 40% of them are for white and Hispanic individuals. But they're equal in the representation in the broader population. So this disproportionately impacts members of our communities of color in the city of Richmond. So that tells us then a little bit as well about what they were doing beforehand, and where these things occur can help us co-locate things like cooling stations, things like shade structures, things like parks. And we'll get back to that a little bit later, because the more important story that has come out of some of this work, or one of the important stories, is the one that really came out of a few different aspects of our research together. So Vivek, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. So, one of the things that's really strange about heat and kind of temperature studies is trying to understand like why this heat is where it is. It turns out it's not a coincidence. It's not just hotter in one place because that's where the sun shines harder and that's where we can, feel the temperatures more. It actually is part of what you and I and everybody participate in what's called an urban planning process. So we decide where the big apartment buildings go through a process. We decide how wide the sidewalks need to be through a process. We decide where the industrial facilities, like the big manufacturing facilities, where those go, where the highways go, the freeways, etc. We decide all that through these social processes. And a big part of that really comes down to what happened in the 1930s, right? Think about, if you know a little bit about history, think about the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected. It's the Great Depression, and there's a real push to try to say, how are we going to get our country back up on its feet? People are losing their homes because they're losing their jobs. And there's a real concern around what can we do. So Roosevelt works with Congress to come up with this thing called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. And that's become now a notorious organization because what they essentially did was work with cities around the country. This is a federal agency, and work with cities around the country saying, hey, Richmond, hey, Portland, hey, Alabama, hey, Birmingham, hey, Austin, Texas, etc. Like, tell us where in your places are the riskiest places for us to be investing in. So if we're going to help people keep their homes, stay in their homes, help them with mortgages so that they can pay for their homes. These are big bank loans, basically. to buy a house, buy an expensive house during coming out of a recession or a depression at the time, the local folks said, okay, we're going to divide up our cities based on 4 different grades, A, B, C, D. And the A grade was considered the best, like invest in those places. The B was considered the B was still desirable, and the C was definitely declining, and the D was, quote, hazardous. So the D areas were redlined. And so some of you may have heard that term redlining. And so that particular policy that played out in over 200 cities across the country really defined what was risky for investment. You might be asking, like, what does risk have to do with heat? And if you look at this map, what's really interesting is we see the areas that are hotter are often in 1930s deemed as riskier. So what Jeremy and I have really been engaging in a conversation is this question of, like, why are these places hotter? Well, it turns out pretty consistently across the US, they're hotter because we made decisions in the 1930s that are affecting our health and well-being today. If you go to the next slide, we can get into this a little bit more. Jeremy, you want to take this over?
Sure. So when we and I have to acknowledge that some of the initial consciousness and awareness around these redlining maps were in part from the University of Richmond's Mapping Inequality project. If you're interested in learning more, they've done some astounding work making these maps publicly available for researchers like us to investigate our questions. And so I had to make sure that I gave them props, because consciousness around that in Richmond is part of what inspired me to start looking at the temperatures through these lenses, and really developed Vivek and I's argument around this paper. And so what we did was to look at not only just Richmond, but nationally, what's going on when we're looking and thinking about how these temperatures might be different from one space to another, which we had seen in a couple of different places, is how can we analyze this all kind of at the same time, and look between cities and in regions, and understand more about how these relationships might be different across space in our country. And so what we did was to amalgamate some of the bigger cities that have a lot of the HOLC maps drawn for individual kind of like townships or smaller cities around them. And what we did was to then look at where those maps overlapped with land surface temperatures as remotely sensed by the Landsat satellite. It's just like in many ways, the thermal photo that I showed you of the parking lot before, only it's on a satellite that's flying over us every 2 weeks or so in space, and basically seeing that temperature of the ground surface. And so what we're able to do then is to pass and look through all of those maps at once at those ground surface temperatures during the summer in the years between 2014 to 2017. And what I've done here then is to register what the average temperature of those polygons, those different shapes that were drawn in those different colors around those cities, and just ask the program, what's the average temperature relative to the citywide temperature in all of those cities. And so by showing all of them together here on green, blue, yellow, and red, we see that as you go up go up in temperature, you're also stepping downwards in those grades. So the green areas were the red line or the green line in A-rated neighborhoods. The D-rated areas here are on average nationally about 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer during the summer in their land surface temperatures. And so this pattern is experienced in 94% of the cities that we studied. And so virtually all across any of the HOLC maps that were drawn in the present day, people that are living there, which tend to be lower income communities of color, are experiencing these warmer temperatures in the summer than their non-redlined, predominantly white, predominantly wealthy neighbors from just a few miles away. So really what the kind of bring this down into discussion about what it is that's driving those patterns, we also looked at the relationship between the underlying land cover. What's in these neighborhoods that's either amplifying or dampening that extreme temperature. And so, as many of you I think saw in the invitation, we had a really great treatment of the data from Richmond, Virginia, in this New York Times article by Brad Plumer and Nadia Popovich in 2020. That really shows this in a clear way. And virtually, this is 94% of the cities, this same relationship holds, where the redlined areas here are shown with a red outline and have relatively hotter summertime temperatures. And so when we look at what that underlying land use, what's going on the ground in those places, we see that not only are they paved over more substantially, so these areas, even in the written descriptions from the 1930s, were already being referred to as paved and hot and manufacturing and odors. So these places were in many ways locked into this impervious concrete jungle, as you may have heard it called. Now, also what this means is at the same time and in the opposite direction, there is much more limited tree cover in the present day. Now, this reflects also on a number of different things that came along after redlining. These were things like the urban renewal and the interstate highway system, which was basically located through many of the neighborhoods that were redlined, especially here in Richmond. Jackson Ward, which is here in the center of the screen, was the place where Maggie Walker was the first Black woman to charter a bank that was called the Harlem of the South. And it was completely bulldozed over, and well, in many ways divided to create space for the interstate highway system, which you can see is this dark gray line here that cuts through what is now Gilpin and Jackson Ward. So these places see very much warmer temperatures, much more extensive impervious surfaces, which tend to funnel stormwater and cause more substantial flooding, as well as have fewer trees, which also do beneficial things like cleaning the air and providing us with well-needed shade and respite and time outside. So I want to quickly, before going into kind of some follow-up studies that have happened since, and kind of letting Vivek wrap it up with kind of presenting this vision for what these programs and the heat mapping campaigns can do in your city, is that what are we doing with this information? I think what a lot of us are starting to feel like is all we're hearing about is these substantially historic situations that are disproportionately impacting communities of color and cities throughout the country. Well, in Richmond, we're doing a lot with that information. Is it perfect? No. Are we making progress? Yes. We are, and we need to demand more of it. I will say that the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation funded the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and several community organizations to do de-paving projects and plant over 300 trees in formerly redlined areas of Richmond. So with extensive community engagement in the type and species of tree, where the community has buy-in and voice in that process as well. Also, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has funded us at the Science Museum of Virginia, along with a partnership of 4 community organizations, 3 of which have a strong presence in the South Side, all 4 of which have worked in communities of color for many years to facilitate meaningful public deliberation about what we do in the face of a changing climate in Richmond. And then we have funding actually to then implement some of their ideas in public spaces on the South Side and the North Side of Richmond, which is very, very exciting. I want to point out and give a shout out to Virginia Community Voice, which is one of our partner organizations, who's leading the South Side Greening Community Partnership in Richmond, where they are leading a community engagement phase around one of the 5 new city-owned parcels of land that are going to be transformed into new parks. This is the first time since the 1970s that the city of Richmond has had a huge effort on new park spaces for public use. And the Heat Island data that we produced with Vivek's help in 2017, as well as the redlining context from this paper in 2020, were some of the main motivators for these new park spaces. So we're very, very excited about all of the different things that are going on in Richmond. These are one of just a small, small example of things that are going on. And I'm really, really thrilled about kind of the promise that we have here as more funding becomes available to do even more good things, not only in Richmond, but around the country. And so I'll turn it over to Vivek to kind of reflect a little bit on some of the studies that have come out that have shown similar and related patterns that we identified in our initial work.
Thanks, Jeremy. So just to kind of summarize what we've talked about so far, we're talking about like this really complex set of activities that are happening locally in terms of deciding what goes where in cities and regions. Like, where do we put a freeway or highway? Where do we put a big box store? And those things, each of those decisions have effects on the quality of that landscape. And what these studies, since our 2020 study that was arguably one of the first that brought together a direct climate change issue of heat and of direct equity-based approach of redlining, those two things coming together, we've started seeing more and more research kind of build on this particular contribution that we made, Jeremy and I made. And what we see here is that places around the country, even outside of the ones that we studied in our specific application, are showing that there are differences across tree canopy in different cities. Like, what are places that have more, what are places that have less? And these patterns are becoming more and more consistent. As you'll notice, these are different. Like, when you look at Los Angeles versus Seattle versus Lynchburg versus Philadelphia, like, those patterns are different. That's because each of the places you live have different decision-making processes at work. And who gets the trees and who doesn't get the trees, for example, depends on who's at the table in making those decisions. And historically, communities of color, particularly Black, Latinx, Indigenous communities, haven't been at the table, not because they're not because of any other reason than simply that the systems that we've created are not centered around historically marginalized communities. And so what we are really trying to do is bring this kind of scientific approach in front of decision makers to say, hey, listen, these patterns do exist. They don't happen by coincidence. It's not like a jungle where, natural selection is playing out. This is direct decision making that we've all been hearing about, and we're actually seeing the direct results of some of our decisions that we've made, in this case, almost 100 years later. If you go to the next slide. Continuing this research. Jeremy, you want to talk about this, redlining and health?
Yeah, sure. This is, to kind of bring it around too, is that it's not just the conditions that these neighborhoods and these residents are living in, it's the outcome on their personal, mental, physical health. And so this report came out from the NCRC, just looking at CDC data and reporting various outcomes in people's lives, things like respiratory illnesses and different types of obesity, mental health, and even life expectancy are significantly worse in formerly redlined communities than in the non-redlined neighbors. So what does that suggest? Is that it's virtually not, it's not just the heat. Everything about the experience of life, even the longevity of life, has something to do with where you live, and where you live has something to do with decisions that were made a century ago, which I think, if there's one fact about the United States that is really, one of the most surprising things to learn, is that your zip code is one of the primary predictors of your lifespan, which is just an incredible statistic. And so we're starting to see these also finer scale studies of asthma rates in children, preterm birth in mothers in New York, all showing this consistent picture of of worse outcomes in people that live in formerly redlined areas than in non-redlined areas. And so this just continues to show that by potentially bringing people that have been marginalized and not centered in the past and bringing them to the table, we might actually achieve a longer life expectancy for these people, which I think is a very noble, one of the most noble reasons to really engage in bringing this scientific perspective on the historical context to the table, as Vivek said. And just one last kind of course, additional layer to this is that now there are studies coming out not only about temperature, but also another climate change stressor that is being ramped up, especially in cities, is that redlined areas tend to have higher flood risks than their non-redlined counterparts. And this, of course, has huge implications for insurance, for being able to adapt to rising sea levels in particular places, and ultimately shows that, even today in their given state of precarity, climate change increases that precarity inequitably in our city. So we don't want to continue continuing to show you the negative stuff, but I will say that if you think and you find out that your city wasn't redlined, there are a lot of other planning specific decisions, such as housing covenants, whereby the actual deed of the house, the parcel of land, could never be sold to a person of color. Those happened in neighborhoods all across the country, regardless of whether they were redlined or not. It's one of the kind of classic exclusionary zoning rules that could be used to restrict ownership to white residents and exclude Black residents or residents of color. Now, a really recent paper, July 13th, from Benz and Burney, showed that even across virtually the entire country, in 75% of the counties that had over 10 census tracts, there is a relationship between race and exposure to extreme temperatures, as well as income and extreme temperatures. And so what the kind of idea is here is, we might need to look even broader and in finer detail in these smaller, not as big cities. And we need this work everywhere is also what this means. And if we don't start centering these communities in the decisions that we're making today, I don't feel that we're any better than the decision makers that were working a century ago, because that is echoing today as environmental inequity across our cities. And I will say that Vivek's approach through the Heat Watch engagement model is one of the ways that we can get there. So I'll turn it back over to Vivek to explain that to you.
Sure, and we're just coming around the corner here to kind of close this out. I know it might be pretty late for where some of you are, and your stomachs might be grumbling if you haven't had dinner yet. So just to kind of quickly summarize some of these things, like we have this persistent systemic challenge of heat and the exposure to the hottest places of cities and communities that have been historically marginalized experiencing it. So what can we do about it? And I mentioned this earlier on, where part of what we want to do is really engage locally with the communities in describing those heat risks. And so what are the heat hazards in one neighborhood? Or do they differ from those heat hazards in other neighborhoods? And can we develop tools for examining potential adaptations? Like, can we think about where to put green space? Can we think about where to invest cooling centers? Can we think about places that we might want to paint the roofs white? We've all heard about raising the roof. We're talking here about painting the roof, right? So it's really a attempt to try to bounce that heat back off before it actually hits the surfaces, and trying to do that in ways that would be really centering those places that are experiencing some of the hottest temperatures. And so how do we support communities in building capacity? And that's where I have a day job as a university professor, and I wouldn't have, and I'd be fine in terms of my job, but I was seeing that I wasn't able to work at the level and the depth of the capacity for supporting something as serious as this, where we're seeing, at least in this heat wave that came through the Pacific Northwest, almost 1,000 people are now recorded as having died directly from this heat wave. And so how can we build capacity locally? And as I was watching every year people passing away, I was really compelled to think, what can we do about this? And that's why I started a company myself to just see if I can support communities in doing this engagement work, in developing the tools and the adaptation actions, and supporting this capacity building stage. So that's at least my own story of trying to make this work a bit more accessible to more communities, and really trying to build the opportunities that we can for recognizing that we're getting hotter summers and longer summers. So what can we do at our very local scales to help mitigate some of those impacts? And there's, if you go to the next slide, there's just, 3 steps. You engage locally, you do a campaign with those sensors that I was pointing to before, and then you review and identify potential actions. And I think we're just wrapping this up with a whole set of cities. We've been doing this all around the country. Don't want to spend too much time on this, but you might find yourself somewhere here. If you don't, talk to a local planner, talk to somebody in your community to actually conduct one of these campaigns. They're incredible for activating a direct response to heat. If you go to the next slide, then we're kind of coming into a place where we really need to take very localized actions. And when one neighborhood has disinvestment over time, like in the right, another neighborhood, it isn't coincidental that that neighborhood on the right was highly invested. And so they see the much cooler temperatures while these other neighborhoods have to suffer the hotter temperatures. And that's not by accident. So let's really get engaged with these conversations locally, wherever you are, at the neighborhood, at the city block level, and seeing what you can do to cool your environments from the outside in. So I'll end it there. And then Jeremy, any closing thoughts before we open it up for any discussions?
Sure. I would just say that this photo is from Richmond, Virginia, and I think it's always good to remember when we show these data, they can be very impersonal. Even when we look at a map from above, and it truly is imagining 2 families waking up on a heat wave day, and the immense and fundamental difference of the experience of the heat wave between these 2 families, one living on the left side and one living in the right side. Either waking up in an air-conditioned house or not, walking through a treeless neighborhood or not, driving in a single occupancy vehicle or taking public transportation and waiting at a shadeless bus stop. All of these things are the consequences of decisions that were made a century ago, echoing today as environmental disparities. So I do challenge people on this who are already doing great work to consider how your own missions overlap with the environmental world around you. And we're just so thrilled to have gotten a chance to speak with you all, and we're looking forward to having a discussion. So thanks very much.
All right, I think we'll go ahead and move to, thank you, Dr. Shandas, Dr. Hoffman. That was excellent, and I have so many questions for you, but we'll move into the Q&A portion. I have a question to start, and it's fairly general, but I live in Springfield, Missouri, and I am aware just by looking that there is redlining in my community, and there are differences in areas of the town that I live in. So in a place where that data hasn't been concretely collected, how would someone like myself go about kind of initiating that awareness in a place where it had been officially, I guess, collected?
So I think one of the first things I'd recommend is for everyone here, there is a new tool that's called the Tree Equity Score. And this is brought about by the American Forest Group. And so I'm going to throw it into the chat. And this will bring you to right around Richmond, Virginia. And so you can zoom in and out. And you can probably find your town or city in this and investigate the disparity in tree canopy, as well as indicators relative to the populations that live in the lower tree canopy areas, and just start, bringing this up to represented governmental people, your city council person, the tree, Vivek is the chair of the Urban Forestry Commission for the city of Portland. That would be the kind of person that you should track down and start, talking about that with. There's also another tool that's called the EJ Screen data set from the EPA. And so this is, while it's not the same kind of data in the sense of the tree canopy or anything like that, I'm throwing that into the chat as well, is that you can investigate things like respiratory health indices and exposure to poor air quality. And so what we see in Vivek's, in my work, is that all of these maps look the same. And that's part of the reasoning behind there's this intentional process going on in the background. All of these maps shouldn't look the same. It shouldn't be structural like this. So I'd say just take a look at some of those online tools that already exist. See if you can get some people around you to be interested in having conversations around it. And then, ultimately push for something a little bit more substantial, potentially one of these heat watch campaigns or otherwise. But, these issues overlap in these neighborhoods in many, many ways, whether it's food access or some other transportation related issue. And starting the conversation through the lens of heat or the lens of trees is some ways one way that you might get someone's attention that might have not seen it that way before.
Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, it looks like we have a question that says, I have heard of changes such as planting trees to reduce pavement coverage of neighborhoods, but isn't that a systemic change? But that isn't a systemic change. I have also heard of rethinking urban planning and restructuring entire cities to more livable and walkable and not so car dependent. But with that, I feel there is a danger of gentrification. How do you balance creating a better living environment for communities of color without replacing low-income housing and other necessary structures to ensure that they can remain in their neighborhoods and not have to choose between their community and their health?
I can maybe try that. That's a very thoughtful question. Really interesting parts of this story are starting to come out in the conversation. So we have this like heat, and then the concern is let's throw a bunch of trees at that heat, and that will shade an area. That will the trees will transpire. They will really reduce the overall temperature by absorbing that solar radiation. And we've seen, as the redlining maps will show, cities doing to communities lots of things, whether it's segregating communities or whether in many cases putting trees in a community where a community may not want trees. And so what we really need to be thinking about is how do we co-produce these landscapes together with organizations, and that the cities are working in concert with community-based organizations who often have the trust and the ear of the communities they serve. And so what we've been trying to do in LA, in Jackson, Mississippi, actually, and several other places is develop these co-management plans for heat mitigation. Like, how do you develop a neighborhood scale heat mitigation plan that has not just trees in it, but all the different things one can do, and then engage communities in which one of those might be helpful, not helpful, which one of those might be relevant, and how can the science and the research help inform the selection of specific strategies for a location. And I really think these need to be done at the neighborhood scale, because we connect, because we ultimately, one of the best things you could do for heat is getting to know your neighbors and the people around you. And by doing that, you might identify the communities that might, or the individuals who might be very sensitive to heat. And as a result, you can be that voice for these community-based heat mitigation plans that incorporate potential issues of gentrification from greening, potential issues of maintenance and longevity of these strategies that are used, and really thinking through that in a collective conversation that co-produces the ultimate result of a plan that then has kind of a clear agenda for how to ensure that it's accountable over time. So those are, at least in theory, the kinds of ways one would go about it. It's going to vary place to place. And so that's the thing that I think we're really going to, having really familiarity with your community is a great place to start.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's see, question 2 is similar to what you touched on a bit ago, Dr. Hoffman, but how do we go about locating the decision makers in our district to advocate for more heat reducing building projects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so much of it is local that I fear that I'm not going to give you a very comprehensive answer because here in Richmond, we are, the Commonwealth of Virginia is just that. It's a Commonwealth. So it's a very interesting state governmental system that's very much based in kind of the parliamentary system of England, which is what it was designed after. So I would say the first thing to do, there's also an online thing called Who's My Representative, I think, or there's a tool that you can use on the internet. Not just the House though. I think that there's I think you can find, it's My Reps, this website, I'm throwing it into the, I'm only sending this out to the panelists. I'm sorry, panelists and attendees. I've been only sending things to the panelists. So sorry, Brian, I actually tried to respond to you before, but myreps.datamade.us can tell you a little bit about some of the local county officials that represent you. And so there are some online tools for figuring out who it is that represents you. And so then it's a very easy thing of picking up the phone or sending an email to their liaison or their office. Most of the time, these folks will respond to you. But then I would say that beyond the local representatives and the elected officials, that there are organizations, I am sure, that are currently working in boundary related issues that would want to hear about this as well. So like I mentioned before, groups that might be working in food justice and food access, urban agriculture, master naturalists and gardeners, tree steward organizations. Those are the sorts of groups that can start to grow your network very rapidly and start to kind of pull pull you towards organizations and individuals that are aware of who the kind of player makers are, or whatever we want to call them. So I think that there's two prongs to it, to sum up. One is to figure out who represents you, who is the person making those decisions. And then two, who are the organizations that I could either go and volunteer with or try and help connect new dots to amplify their mission in the space that they're already operating in.
Awesome, thank you. Question 3 is, do you think minority people having life insurance would reduce these issues? It seems like very deliberate action taken by those at the decision-making table to exclude. It seems like there are deliberate actions taken by those at the decision-making table to exclude these communities. And when they're given life insurance, the government will have to take responsibility for the health of these people and therefore reduce the intentional exclusion of these communities.
Vivek, I'm definitely not a life insurance expert. I think that's kind of well outside of my experience. So I can't really speak much to it, and I apologize for not being able to shine on it. Vivek, do you have any?
Nice way to put me on the spot, Jeremy. I will try this. This is interesting. I don't know. I'm trying to connect the dots here where there's life insurance. So life insurance is something that I purchase individually from a private company to be able to remunerate my family when I die. So the fact that I would die prematurely as a result of a heat wave. I'm trying to connect, like, is that the mechanism? I'm trying to figure out, is that the pathway by which life insurance could help to address some of the systemic challenges that are in place? And I'm not quite able to connect those dots. So I'd love a little bit of clarification, I guess. Because I'm talking about we're not talking about individuals making decisions on their own. We're trying to keep the conversation at like a systems level, at like we had the earlier question, like what are the systems in place that would help address some of these often race-based and income-based strategies that put more people in harm's way for no cause of their own. So the individual choice thing of life insurance, I'm not quite sure how that would play out. Rivers and flooding insurance, that's a whole nother question, which I'd be happy to chat about.
All right, thank you. Question 4 is, giving people seats at the table seems to be the key, but what if the people in power refuse to have seats at the table to resolve environmental issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak to some of the experience that I've had in Richmond is, I think what we're seeing is through climate action plans, the RVA Green 2050 plan here, as well as our Richmond 300 comprehensive plan, that many community members were identifying those structural inequities in the manifestation of government kind of, and how things are just done in places versus kind of like asked and kind of engaged with. And so like the idea of procedural, distributional, and structural inequity in how decisions are made was kind of brought about by a bunch of nonprofit organizers and individuals that are aware of these issues. So the part of it is to gain enough of a like socialization of these issues with people around you, and you start to build the power from the ground up. I don't have a good solution for how to work on it other than voting. If there's someone that's a representative or an elected official, like a mayor or a city council, can do a lot of things. And so by knowing who that person is, seeing how they vote, seeing where they put their priorities in the city budget, those sorts of things can tell you a lot about what those person's priorities are. And so by organizing with individuals, excuse me, had a sneeze, by organizing with groups, recognizing your network, seeing where your spheres of influence can be and how to grow that, you can start to make the kind of a socialization around these issues that will eventually make progress. I know it can feel exceedingly slow and really not at the pace of what's needed to address the issues. But these sorts of bringing together people and working to reach a consensus around these sorts of things is how we've been able to do a lot of the work that we've gotten done in Richmond, which still isn't enough, but at least we've done something so far.
Thank you. And Dr. Hoffman, I know you answered this question in the chat, but just in case you or Dr. Shandas would like to add to it, I'm going to read it. Do you have any sense for how the location of the areas that were redlined had disadvantages prior to the redlining?
Well, maybe I'll just quickly say that, as somebody who studies cities for a bit, redlining is just a manifestation of something that existed for long before redlining ever was officially a policy by the federal government that you could sue people over and things like that. Before redlining, there was a number of what were called racial covenants. Like these are city level policies that would draw specific lines around places in cities where primarily African American individuals could not buy homes. Like that was an official racial covenant where this place is, and I've seen it in my town of Portland, Oregon, which is essentially a whites only state. When you go back to the beginning, 1859, when Oregon was created as a state, it was a whites only state. It was quiet on slavery. And what we see now is that all of that pattern of where people lived, and often communities who are very precarious, they find strength when they come together. And so what we see is this spatial clustering of communities very close to one another. It's similar to how, like, my parents, when they immigrated from India to the US, they found other people who were from the same part of India that they were, and they bought homes right by them. And so there's this like real human like behavioral response to want to be around folks that look like you, or maybe speak the same language of you as you, or worship the same religion as you, et cetera, et cetera. And this kind of clustering of communities together was something very convenient for a lot of decision making, to be able to say, hey, this area is considered risky. And so before redlining even existed, there were plenty of processes that were happening all over the country. And I'll just put a quick little side note. I'm talking to folks in South Africa. We're doing this campaign in South Africa. I hope, if the Delta variant is kept at bay in South Africa and doesn't create a lot of challenges. But if we do this, we're doing this campaign in South Africa of heat, and people are telling me in South Africa that the same kind of apartheid created very similar patterns of segregation. And when you look at the heat maps from satellite imagery of those areas in Johannesburg, for example, that I've looked at, it's very similar to what we're seeing in the US. So it's not just something in the US, it really has played out in many parts around the world, particularly places that were colonized.
It's amazing. I just want to say that, like, that's an incredible. I hope you do get to do that campaign, Vivek. I wanted to throw an extra thing in here. Is this TED Talk from 2018, and the colonizer aspect of it is an interesting one that I hadn't really thought of, but in European cities and American cities where the Industrial Revolution was very quick, and pollution was really one of the main drivers for where people would kind of cluster, at least wealth would tend to cluster on the western side of cities. It seems like it's based on the spin of the earth in some ways, is one of the reasons why today the eastern side of cities tends to be where you call the wrong side of the tracks. So take a look at that TED Talk from Stephen DeBerry if you want to know a little bit more about that. What Vivek is getting at is that there's always been systems of oppression that have been working to keep in certain individuals in one place, while not allowing them to move outside of it. So this is one of the stories that I find really, really intriguing.
Awesome, thank you both. And Dr. Shandas, I have one quick kind of follow-up question for you. But when you're mentioning South Africa, prior to that, I was thinking of the Jewish ghettos during World War II and places where there were more rigid caste systems in India. Would you expect to see the same like heat mapping in places like that around the world in modern communities?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It comes up in part in my read of it, and it's kind of speculative in a sense, but in my read of it, a lot of where you see the hottest places are usually the places where you see the most amount of like heavy, dense materials that have been placed there. Like in very disinvested areas, like sidewalks won't even often have that little strip between the sidewalk and the road where you can put trees and where often water meters and things are. Like that strip doesn't exist because it's all paved over. And so what we see is, like when freeway projects go in, as we were saying, or other large scale, very dense material types of developments, like housing projects or industrial facilities. Like these things really attract heat and hold on to them. So I'm thinking about places in India, for example, where I've traveled extensively, and I'm thinking about, for example, the informal settlements. Some people call them slums. And these places, they don't have a lot of that infrastructure. Like it's tin, it's like cloth, it's like very limited. And so I'm not sure we would see the same kind of patterns of like amplified temperatures in the slums of Mumbai as we would in some of the wealthier communities there that have built out like palaces in some cases of huge compounds and lots of concrete and other materials that would hold heat. So it's interesting. I don't think it's a generalizable theory about disinvestment and heat. I do think that it plays out very contextually in different countries based on what the cultural, colonial, and various other forms of governance that have happened over time. So it's a super interesting question. I'd love to dig into it a bit more on kind of on a global level.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shandas and Dr. Hoffman. That's all the questions that we have, so I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie Rolfe for closing remarks.
Thank you, Grace, for being such a great host for us tonight. And special thanks to Dr. Hoffman and to Dr. Shandas for giving us so much to think about. I don't want to keep anybody much longer, but one of the things that strikes me, and I'm a trained historian, so the science part of this is too far afield for me to speak with much insight here. But one of the things that really interested me about some of the findings and some of the approaches, especially when we think about intervention strategies, is the way in which you're sort of thinking about the heat watch campaigns on a local level and activating folks at the local level, and how that localized approach is really common across a lot of the intervention strategies that many of our interns are working in right now and learning from their agencies and being mentored about. And so I didn't want to miss the chance to really highlight that for on the SHEP side of things, how much more manageable it is to kind of think about this in smaller bites, and how unique local places can be in terms of understanding these big, what seem like complicated concepts. I'm also thinking about, one of the things that fascinates me about your presentation and the profile of your research and the way that this is active on the ground is, you're sort of encountering two contested truths here. One being climate change, right? Which has become such a political issue. And the second one being the presence of systemic racism, which is what the controversy over critical race theory really is about. And so I just wanted to note that, and note for our audience tonight that this is intersection. This is intersectionality. This is the way in which we are entering spaces that have overlapping obstacles that are tied to our history and tied to location and opportunity and all of those different things. So many thanks to both of you for entering into this space and really translating it in a way that we can understand, especially myself. I'm sure that many of the people who are on this right now maybe can read this a little bit better, but I think it's incredible work. And to all of our SHEP interns out there, this is our final keynote, and I think that there have been a lot of really incredible and innovative approaches that you have had access to. And I hope that you will consider ways that you can be a part of these communities, because there's lots of expertise out there that's intervening at the point where your passions are and where your interests are. So again, thank you all for joining us. And I hope that the remainder of the internship goes smoothly for you. Thank you to our speakers for sharing your time with us. And I hope everybody has a lovely evening, and I hope the weekend comes early for you.